The rhythmic hum of the USS Leviathan was a vibration Bristol Bright felt in his marrow, a mechanical heartbeat that usually signaled safety. But tonight, the frequency was off. In the dim, blue-tinted light of the navigation suite, Bristol leaned so close to his console that the screen's glow reflected in his dilated pupils. While the rest of the bridge crew relied on the automated Aegis mapping arrays, Bristol was looking at the raw data. The noise, the billion-dollar system was programmed to filter out. "There it is again," he whispered, his voice raspy from hours of silence. On his screen, a jagged spike disrupted the smooth green line of the sonar return. It was a ghost signal, a micro-vibration originating from the seafloor 5,000 feet below. To the ship's primary sensors, it was likely dismissed as a whale song or thermal venting. But Bristol had spent his life reading the ocean's temperament, and the ocean was currently screaming. "Bright, you're still staring at that phantom?" Commander Vance's voice cut through the room like a serrated blade. Vance was a man who worshipped the manual and loathed anything he couldn't find in a pre-printed chart. He stood behind Bristol, the polished brass on his uniform catching the light, a stark contrast to Bristol's rumpled working blues. "It's not a phantom, sir," Bristol said, not moving his eyes from the screen. He moved with a stiff, deliberate slowness, his broad shoulders hunched as if bracing for the dismissal he knew was coming. "The resonance is shifting. We're seeing a 0.5% deviation in tectonic frequency. It's a precursor to a crustal collapse. If we stay on this heading, we're sailing right over a tectonic rift that's about to unzip." Vance let out a short, sharp laugh that held no mirth. "A 0.5 deviation? The Leviathan is the most advanced piece of sovereign territory on the planet. If there were a rift, the fleet command sensors in Pearl Harbor would have flagged it before you even finished your coffee. You're chasing ghosts, Bristol." Again. Bristol's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his desk. He could feel the familiar heat of judgment burning into his back. To Vance and the other officers, Bristol was a liability, a man obsessed with anomalies and gut feelings, in a world of rigid digital certainty. They saw his hypervigilance as instability, never suspecting that his intuition had been forged in the high-stakes pressure of deep-sea recovery ops where a misvibration meant a crushed hull. "The system is programmed to ignore signals of this frequency to prevent false alarms," Bristol explained, his voice flat and cold, the tremor of exhaustion replaced by a sudden, hard authority. "But the data doesn't lie. Look at the tracheal. Look at the rift's expansion rate. It's asymmetrical. The sensors are normalizing the data because they don't have a baseline for a collapse of this scale. If we don't change course, we won't just hit a wave. The ocean floor is going to drop out from under us." Vance stepped into Bristol's personal space, his height used as a tool of intimidation. "You are a navigator, Bright. I am the executive officer. You don't diagnose the planet, you follow the coordinates I give you. Do I need to report you for insubordination again?" Bristol looked down at the XO's scuffed boots, the silence in the suite growing heavy. He saw the ghost of a different disaster in his mind, the smell of ozone and the sound of metal twisting under impossible pressure. He knew he was right. He knew the ship was steaming toward a graveyard. But as he looked at the screen, the spike flared again, higher this time. The ghost signal was no longer a whisper, it was a countdown. And he was the only one on the 300-meter ship who could hear it. The tension in the navigation suite didn't dissipate, it curdled. As Commander Vance maintained his suffocating proximity, the heavy door to the bridge hissed open, admitting Lieutenant Miller and Ensign Graves. They were the Golden Boys of the Midwatch, officers who treated the deployment like a high-stakes video game where the only score that mattered was their standing with the captain. "Still hunting the Kraken, Bright?" Miller asked, his voice dripping with a casual, practiced cruelty. He tossed a crumpled protein bar wrapper onto Bristol's console, right next to the screen displaying the flickering seismic data. "I heard you almost convinced the XO we were going to be swallowed by the Earth. You've got a vivid imagination for a guy who's supposed to be reading a map." Bristol didn't reach for the wrapper. He didn't even flinch. He remained as still as the deep-sea trenches he studied, his eyes fixed on the green line that was beginning to stutter with increasing frequency. The contrast was agonizing. The bridge crew lived in a world of polished brass and career trajectories, while Bristol lived in the raw, cold reality of the abyss. "The resonance is up to 0.7%, Bristol said, his voice a low, steady drone that ignored the mockery. "The interval between the pulses is shrinking. We are approaching the edge of the fracture zone. Requesting a secondary scan from the bow-mounted sonar." Graves snorted, leaning against a bulkhead. "Do you have any idea what it costs to calibrate the bow sonar for a deep-crust scan, Bright? We're on a routine patrol. The Admiral is watching our efficiency ratings from the Pentagon. We aren't going to delay the mission because you think the ocean floor feels twitchy. It isn't a feeling," Bristol replied, finally turning his head. His gaze was flat, haunted by a clarity that unnerved Graves for a fleeting second. "It's physics. The mass of this carrier is acting like a hammer on a cracked pane of glass. Every mile we sail on this heading is another strike." Vance stepped forward, his face reddening. "Enough. This is the problem with you, Bright. You think your expertise entitles you to bypass the chain of command. You think you're more important than the data being fed to us by the entire Atlantic Fleet Command. You're not a visionary, you're an alarmist who's one bad report away from a psych evaluation." The bridge crew chuckled, a sound that felt more dangerous to Bristol than the tectonic rift. It was the sound of institutional ego, the absolute, unwavering belief that the system could not be wrong. They looked at Bristol and saw a man who didn't fit, a sailor who smelled of salt and old books instead of the sterile, air-conditioned certainty of the modern Navy. "Look at him," Miller whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's shaking. Is it the rift, Bristol, or are you just realizing that you're about to be the only navigator in history to get fired for being afraid of the water?" Bristol looked at his hands. They weren't shaking from fear. It was the vibration of the ship, the subtle, high-frequency shudder of the Leviathan as its hull began to resonate with the unstable ground below. He could feel it through the soles of his boots, a secret conversation between the steel and the stone that no one else was humble enough to hear. "I am not afraid of the water, sir," Bristol said softly, looking Vance directly in the eye, a breach of protocol that made the XOs stiffen. "I am afraid of the silence that comes after the ship breaks. And if you don't change course in the next 20 minutes, that's the only thing you'll be left with." Vance's jaw tightened. The insult of Bristol's directness was the final straw. "Get out of the suite, Bright. You're relieved of duty. Miller, take the helm. We're staying on course." As Bristol stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the glowing consoles, he didn't look like a disgraced officer. He looked like a man who had already started mourning the people in the room. He walked toward the exit, the protein bar wrapper still sitting on his desk, a tiny piece of trash on a ship that was fast becoming a ghost. The captain's quarters were not a room, they were a sanctuary of order, smelling of stale coffee and industrial-grade floor wax. Captain Holloway sat behind a mahogany desk that seemed bolted to the very soul of the ship. He didn't look up as Bristol was marched in by Commander Vance. The silence was punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the Leviathan's engines, a sound Bristol now heard as the clicking of a hammer on an empty chamber. "The XO tells me you've become a prophet, Bright," Holloway said, his voice a low gravel. He finally looked up, his eyes cold and weary. "He tells me you're predicting the end of the world while my bridge crew is trying to conduct a Grade A tactical patrol." "Not the world, sir," Bristol said, his voice devoid of the tremor the others expected. "Just this sector. The seafloor is structurally compromised. The thermal expansion from the rift is creating a pocket of low-density water directly ahead. We aren't going to sail over it, we're going to sink into it." Vance scoffed from the corner. "He's still at it, Captain. Even after I relieved him, he was shouting about atmospheric pressure drops in the corridor. He's causing a panic among the enlisted." Holloway stood slowly, the sheer weight of his authority pressing down on the small room. He walked around the desk until he was inches from Bristol. I have 5,000 souls on this ship. I have a mission window that is closing by the minute. What I do not have, sailor, is the patience for a navigator who has lost his grip on reality. You've been a thorn in this command's side since Norfolk. Your anomalies and your hunches are a cancer to the morale of this fleet. The data is the truth, Captain, Bristol replied, his jaw tight. Even if it's inconvenient. The truth is what I say it is on this vessel, Holloway snapped. He reached out, his fingers hooking under the silver insignia pinned to Bristol's collar. With a violent, sharp yank, the metal tore away from the fabric, leaving a jagged hole. You are hereby stripped of your rank and your posting. You are a civilian occupant on a military vessel, and under the Articles of Maritime Safety, I am declaring you a psychological hazard to the mission. The air left the room. To a man like Bristol, the loss of the insignia wasn't just a loss of job, it was the erasure of his identity. But he didn't look away. He looked at the empty space on his collar, then back at Holloway. Since we are currently within 12 miles of the neutral littoral zone, Holloway continued, his voice dropping to a deathly calm. And since you are so convinced this ship is a coffin, I'm going to grant your wish. I won't have your poison on my bridge for 1 more hour. The process was swift and clinical, a nightmare draped in naval protocol. Bristol was marched to the lower hangar deck, past rows of silent sailors who looked at his bare collar with a mix of pity and horror. They didn't see a hero, they saw a madman being purged. A weathered wooden rowboat, used for home maintenance and traditional drills, was winched out over the churning gray Atlantic. The Leviathan didn't stop, it slowed just enough for the drop. Bristol was forced into the small craft with nothing but the clothes on his back and the rigid, terrifying certainty that he was right. As the winch cables went slack and the rowboat hit the freezing spray, Bristol looked up. The carrier loomed like a steel mountain, its massive screws kicking up a wake that threatened to capsize his tiny vessel. He saw Vance looking down from a high gallery, a smirk of triumph visible even from the water. The carrier didn't look back. It surged forward, its engines roaring as it resumed full speed, heading straight for the coordinates Bristol had begged them to avoid. Bristol grabbed the oars, his hands steady, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the water was beginning to froth with a strange, unnatural heat. He was alone, disgraced, and discarded, the only man alive who knew exactly where the graves were being dug. The Leviathan left a wake that felt like a mountain range to the small wooden rowboat. Bristol gripped the oars, his knuckles white, as the rhythmic thumping of the carrier's massive screws faded into a dull, low-frequency vibration. Within minutes, the gray steel behemoth was a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight horizon, and then, it was gone. The silence that followed was absolute, but to Bristol, it was deafening. He wasn't looking at the horizon. He was looking at the water. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, brass-cased stopwatch, a relic from his grandfather, and a stubby pencil. He had no charts, no GPS, and no satellite link, but the ocean spoke a language of physics that didn't require a screen. He leaned over the side of the boat, his hand dipping into the water. The temperature had risen 4 degrees in the last 20 minutes. The salt spray on his lips tasted metallic, a sign of deep-crust minerals being forced upward by the expanding rift. He began to scratch calculations into the raw wood of the rowboat's seat. Carrier speed, 30 knots. Distance to the fracture apex, 14 miles. Tectonic resonance, 0.75% and climbing. The math was a cold, hard comfort. It was the only thing that hadn't betrayed him. Based on the rate of the deep-sea tremors he could feel through the hull of the boat. Shudders that felt like the earth itself was shivering. The time to impact wasn't a matter of hours. It was a matter of minutes. 12 minutes, Bristol whispered to the empty air. He looked at his hands. They were perfectly still now. Without the mocking eyes of Miller or the suffocating presence of Vance, the shaking had vanished. He wasn't a disgraced sailor anymore. He was a calculator in a floating box. He knew that in exactly 12 minutes, the water pressure ahead of the Leviathan would plummet as the rift unzipped, creating a localized hole in the ocean. The carrier wouldn't capsize. It would simply lose its buoyancy and slide into the abyss like a car driving off a cliff. A low, guttural groan echoed from the depths, a sound so primal it seemed to vibrate the very cells of his body. Bubbles of methane and sulfur began to hiss on the surface, turning the dark water into a frothing, toxic soup. Bristol braced his boots against the floorboards. He was sitting at the exact edge of the stable shelf, the coordinates of the safe point he had begged the captain to aim for. He watched the spot where the carrier had disappeared. There was a terrible, tragic irony in it. The more the ship accelerated to prove its dominance over his hallucinations, the faster it raced toward its own funeral. "Turn around," he urged, his voice cracking. "Just look at the sonar one more time." But the horizon remained empty. The only thing with him was the stopwatch, ticking away the seconds of 5,000 lives. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of survivor's guilt, a weight heavier than the ocean itself. He had been cast out for trying to save them, and now he was the only witness to a tragedy that hadn't happened yet. 9 minutes. 8. The water around the rowboat began to swirl in a slow, clockwise rotation. The ghost signal was no longer a ghost, it was a physical force, pulling at his oars. Bristol sat rigid, his jaw set, watching the empty space where the most powerful ship in the world was about to become a memory. He didn't pray, he navigated. He kept his eyes on the coordinates, waiting for the moment the ocean would claim the pride of the fleet, and wondering if anyone would ever believe that the man in the rowboat had seen it all coming. Hundreds of miles away, within the sterile, hushed sanctuary of the Fleet Operations Center, Admiral Jonathan R. Whitaker sat before a panoramic wall of monitors that displayed the heartbeat of the Atlantic. Unlike the bridge of the Leviathan, there was no ego here, only the cold, blue light of global surveillance. Whitaker was a man of silver hair and eyes that had seen 3 decades of naval warfare, yet today, those eyes were narrowed in a look of profound unease. "Run the diagnostic again," Whitaker commanded, his voice a low vibration that commanded immediate silence from the room of technicians. "Sir, the Aegis mapping arrays are showing green across the board," a young lieutenant replied, tapping a touchscreen. "The Leviathan is on schedule, maintaining 30 knots on her assigned patrol vector. Everything is within standard parameters." "Standard parameters are for peacetime drills, Lieutenant," Whitaker said, standing up and walking toward the main screen. He pointed to a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker in the telemetry data, a rhythmic stutter in the deep-sea pressure sensors. "Look at the secondary feed. The raw acoustic data from the SOSUS line. We're filtering out low-frequency noise. Stop filtering it." The technician's fingers flew across the keyboard. As the software's noise reduction layers were stripped away, the green line on the screen transformed into a jagged, violent sawtooth. The room went cold. It wasn't just noise. It was a rhythmic, escalating pulse coming from the very coordinates the Leviathan was currently occupying. Whitaker felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He recognized that signature. It wasn't a weather pattern or a whale song. It was the sound of the Earth's crust being pulled apart by a thermal expansion pocket, a catastrophic tectonic rift. "My God!" Whitaker whispered, leaning forward until his breath fogged the glass of the monitor. "The coordinates are off. The fleet's baseline data was calibrated to a stagnant shelf, but the shelf is moving." He turned to the navigator beside him, a junior officer who was already pale. "If the Leviathan continues on this heading, what happens when she hits that pressure drop?" The young officer's hands shook as he ran a quick simulation. The digital representation of the carrier on the screen suddenly pitched forward, the buoyancy indicator flashing a lethal red. "Sir, the water density ahead of them is collapsing. It's a localized vacuum. The ship won't just take on water, it will lose displacement. She'll slide into the rift like she's falling off a cliff." Whitaker's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at the ship's log, his eyes searching for the name of the officer who had signed off on the course. But his gaze snagged on a small, red flag notification in the corner of the screen. Personnel action, Navigator Bristol Bright. Status, relieved of duty. Reason, insubordination/psychological instability. Whitaker pulled up Bright's private file. It was a redacted masterpiece of brilliant, unorthodox navigation. He saw the warnings Bright had logged, warnings that had been dismissed as hallucinations by Captain Halloway and Commander Vance. Bright hadn't been crazy. He had been the only person in the entire Atlantic Fleet who was actually looking at the truth. "Get me a direct line to the Leviathan," Whitaker roared, the authority of a 4-star admiral finally breaking the stunned silence of the room. "Comms are down, sir. The tectonic resonance is creating a massive electromagnetic interference. We can't reach them." Whitaker looked back at the monitor. The Leviathan was now only minutes away from the fracture apex. He saw the coordinates Bright had suggested as the safe point, a tiny, stable patch of ocean that everyone else had ignored. On the screen, a small, unidentified blip sat precisely at those coordinates. "Who is at those coordinates?" Whitaker asked, his voice trembling with a mix of horror and sudden, desperate hope. "It's a life pod or a small craft, sir. No transponder." Whitaker's eyes stung. He realized then that the system hadn't just failed, it had exiled the only man who could save it. "That's not a blip," Whitaker said, his voice raw. "That's our North Star. Get my transport ready." "I'm going out there myself." The roar of the Admiral's transport helicopter was a violent intrusion into the electromagnetic silence of the rift zone. Inside the cabin, Admiral Whitaker gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles as white as his dress uniform. Below them, the Atlantic was a churning cauldron of frothing white and bruised indigo, the water behaving as if it were being stirred by a giant's hand. "Get me the Leviathan on the emergency distress frequency," Whitaker shouted over the turbine whine. "Sir, the interference is absolute," the comms officer yelled back, pressing his headset against his ears. "The tectonic friction is ionicing the air. We're flying blind." Whitaker grabbed the binoculars, his eyes scanning the horizon. There she was. The USS Leviathan loomed in the distance, a billion-dollar fortress of steel, steamrolling toward the fracture apex with suicidal confidence. To anyone else, she looked invincible. To Whitaker, who now saw the invisible drop-off in the ocean's density on his tablet's offline cache, she looked like a lead weight tethered to a sinking stone. "Target the bridge with the high-intensity signal lamps," Whitaker ordered. "Signal them to cut engines immediately. All stop. Do not pass the 40-second parallel." For a tense minute, the helicopter banked low over the carrier's flight deck. The signal lamps pulsed, a frantic, rhythmic SOS in Morse code. On the bridge, Captain Halloway and Commander Vance surely saw the lights, but their response was a slow, confused hesitation. The carrier slowed, its massive wake beginning to subside, but it was still coasting on its own immense momentum, drifting closer to the invisible edge of the abyss. "They're slowing, but they aren't stopping," Whitaker hissed. "They don't understand why. They think it's a drill." He turned to the navigator beside him, the younger officer who held the nautical charts with trembling hands. "Where is he? Where is Bristol Bright?" The officer checked the last known GPS ping of the rowboat's deployment. "He should be right here, sir. At the 0 point he marked. But in this water, in a wooden boat." The officer didn't finish the sentence. The implication was clear. The turbulence alone should have shattered a rowboat into splinters. "Find him," Whitaker commanded, his voice raw with a desperation that bypassed military decorum. "He is the only baseline we have left. If he's gone, we have no way to calibrate the safe exit path for the carrier. The ship is too heavy to turn back the way it came. They have to thread the needle through the stable shelf, or they'll slide into the rift." The helicopter descended, the downdraft kicking up sprays of salt and sulfurous steam. Whitaker leaned out the open bay door, the wind whipping his silver hair. He wasn't looking for a warship anymore. He was looking for a man. He was looking for the navigator they had called unstable, foreseeing the truth before the machines did. "There!" the pilot shouted. "Small craft at 2 o'clock!" Whitaker adjusted his sights. In the middle of the swirling, toxic foam, a tiny speck of brown wood bobbed precariously. It was a rowboat, looking impossibly small against the backdrop of the massive carrier. In it sat a lone figure, his broad shoulders hunched over the oars, his posture rigid and defiant. He wasn't waving for help. He wasn't screaming. He was simply holding his position, a human marker buoy in a sea of chaos. "He stayed," Whitaker whispered, a lump forming in his throat. "He knew we need a fixed point. That stubborn, brilliant fool stayed." The Admiral turned to his crew, his expression a mask of iron. "Lower the winch. I'm going down. And tell the Leviathan to look at that rowboat. Tell them that's the only reason they're still afloat." The helicopter's winch cable groaned as it lowered Admiral Whitaker into the spray, but the transition from the roaring sky to the heaving ocean felt like descending into a tomb. He dropped into his own command rowboat, manned by a silent oarsman and a navigator clutching a nautical chart like a holy relic. The water here was different, unnervingly calm, a small patch of glassy stability surrounded by a ring of frothing, sulphurous chaos. At the dead center of this stillness sat Bristol Bright. The disgraced sailor looked like a fragment of a forgotten era. His dark navy work jacket was torn where his insignia had been ripped away, and his face was masked by a crust of salt and exhaustion. He didn't move as the Admiral's boat pulled alongside. He simply sat with his oars shipped, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the empty air as if he could still see the mathematical lines of the rift's boundaries. "Officer Bright," Whitaker called out. His voice, usually a thunderous instrument of command, was cracked and raw. Bristol slowly turned his head. There was no fear in his expression, nor was there the smug satisfaction of a man proven right. There was only a profound, weary resignation. "The rift unzipped at 1904, Admiral," Bristol said, his voice a dry rasp. "The pressure drop is currently 400 psi below baseline. The Leviathan is coasting on a 3-degree incline toward the shelf break. If they don't hardbank to starboard now, they're gone." The junior officer beside Whitaker looked down at his chart, his eyes widening as his finger traced the coordinates Bristol had scratched into the wood of his own boat. "Sir," the officer whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and guilt. "He's right. Every digit. He's sitting on the only stable tectonic pillar in the entire sector. The data we gave you, we were wrong. Everything we told the captain was wrong." Whitaker looked from the chart to the massive, grey wall of the Leviathan, which had finally come to a shivering halt just hundreds of yards from the invisible precipice. The silence between the two rowboats was heavy, filled with the weight of 5,000 lives that had nearly been extinguished by the arrogance of a chart. Whitaker stood up. The small boat rocked under him, but his posture was as rigid as it had been on the day of his commissioning. He looked at Bristol. This man who had been mocked, stripped of his dignity, and cast into the abyss, only to stay and act as a lighthouse for the very people who had betrayed him. The Admiral's hand moved. It wasn't the brisk, mechanical salute of a morning color ceremony. It was a slow, deliberate motion that carried the weight of an apology that words could never reach. Whitaker's hand snapped to the brim of his cap, his arm trembling slightly with the force of his emotion. He stood tall in his pristine whites, a 4-star admiral saluting a sailor without a rank, while tears carved tracks through the salt on his aged face. "The coordinates were right, Bristol!" Whitaker shouted, his voice breaking over the sound of the distant, groaning deep. "God help us, the coordinates were right." Beside him, the junior officer followed suit, snapping a salute that was a silent plea for forgiveness. The witness at the oars bowed his head, acknowledging the gravity of the moment. Bristol watched them, his own hand slowly rising, not out of habit, but out of a shared understanding of the sea's terrible truth. Behind them, the Leviathan began its desperate, slow-motion turn, its engines roaring in a low, sub-bass frequency as it followed the safe point Bristol had held. The liability of the fleet had become its only hope, and as the Admiral held the salute, the hierarchy of the Navy dissolved into the spray, leaving only two men and the undeniable truth of the ocean. The roar of the Leviathan's secondary thrusters was a desperate, mechanical scream as the massive ship fought its own inertia, pivoting away from the abyss. On the carrier's bridge, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and the static of a dying world. Captain Holloway stood frozen, his eyes glued to the forward view screen where the ocean seemed to physically tilt. Then, the bridge doors hissed open with a violence that made every officer jump. Admiral Whitaker strode in, his white dress uniform stained with salt and grease, his face a mask of cold, righteous fury. Behind him walked Bristol Bright. The sailor was still in his torn work blues, his shoulders square, looking not like a prisoner, but like a man who had returned from the dead to collect a debt. "Admiral on the bridge!" Ensign Graves croaked, his voice cracking in terror. Holloway turned, his face pale. "Admiral? Aye, we've had a navigational anomaly. We're correcting the course now. It seems the data didn't fail you, Holloway." Whitaker's voice cut through the room like a whip. "You failed the data. You chose the comfort of a chart over the life of your ship." Whitaker stepped into the center of the command deck, his presence dwarfing the captain. He turned to look at the empty space on Bristol's collar, the jagged tear where the insignia had been ripped away. The silence that followed was more deafening than the tectonic groans outside. "Commander Vance," Whitaker said, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet register. Vance stepped forward, his habitual smirk long gone, replaced by a twitching lip. "Sir? You mocked this man. You called his expertise a hallucination. You stood on this bridge and watched him being lowered into a grave because his truth was an insult to your ego." Whitaker pointed a trembling finger at the main screen, where the sonar now clearly showed the yawning tectonic rift they had just narrowly avoided. "If Bristol Bright hadn't held that coordinate, if he hadn't been the fixed point in that storm, this bridge would currently be under 2 miles of water. Every soul on this ship belongs to him now." Holloway tried to speak, but the words died in his throat as Whitaker turned his gaze toward him. "Captain, you will return what you stole. Now." With shaking hands, Holloway reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the silver insignia he had confiscated. He moved toward Bristol, but Whitaker stepped between them, taking the metal pins himself. The Admiral turned to Bristol, his expression softening into one of profound respect. "Officer Bright," Whitaker said, loud enough for every member of the bridge crew to hear. "I cannot erase the insult of the last few hours. But I can ensure that no one in this fleet ever ignores the truth again." Whitaker pinned the silver back onto Bristol's collar, smoothing the torn fabric with a heavy hand. "By my authority as fleet commander, I am reinstating your rank, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am initiating a formal inquiry into the command climate of this vessel." Bristol looked at the bridge crew, at Miller, Graves, and Vance. They couldn't meet his eyes. The silent witness of the ocean had become the judge of the room. Bristol didn't feel a rush of triumph, he felt a somber clarity. He looked at the sonar, seeing the Leviathan finally reaching the stable waters he had predicted hours ago. "The ship is safe, Admiral," Bristol said quietly. It was the only vindication he needed. Whitaker nodded, then turned back to Holloway with eyes of flint. "The ship is safe. But your command is over. Pack your things, Captain. The navigator is taking us home." The bridge, once a place of mocking laughter and arrogant certainty, was now a tomb of shamed silence, punctuated only by the steady, reliable hum of a ship that had been saved by the man it tried to destroy. The transition from the salt-sprayed deck of the Leviathan to the sun-drenched coast of Coronado was more than a change of scenery. It was a shift in the very axis of Bristol Bright's life. The air here didn't smell of tectonic sulfur or the suffocating anxiety of the carrier's bridge. It smelled of eucalyptus and the clean, cold Pacific. Bristol stood at the head of a high-tech lecture hall at the Naval Special Warfare Command. On the glass displays behind him, complex topographical maps of the ocean floor pulsed in real time, fed by the new Bright-Whittaker protocol sensors he had helped design. He no longer wore the rumpled work blues of a disgraced sailor. His uniform was crisp, his silver bars gleaming, but more importantly, the hunch in his shoulders was gone. He stood with the quiet, immovable authority of a man who had stood at the edge of the world and refused to blink. In front of him sat 30 of the Navy's brightest young navigators and tactical officers. They didn't look at him with the mockery of Miller or the condescension of Vance. They looked at him with an intensity bordering on awe. They had all heard the story, the legend of the man in the rowboat who had stared down a 4-star admiral and a tectonic rift, armed with nothing but a pencil and the truth. "The system is a tool, not a master," Bristol began, his voice echoing with a steady, resonant power. "Most of you have been taught that if the screen is green, the path is safe. You've been taught to trust the algorithm because the algorithm doesn't have an ego." He walked to the front row, stopping before a young ensign whose hands were hovering nervously over a tablet. Bristol didn't scold him. Instead, he reached out and placed a steady hand on the young man's shoulder. "But the ocean doesn't care about your hardware," Bristol continued. "The ocean speaks in frequencies the machines are programmed to ignore. Your job isn't to follow the chart. Your job is to feel the vibration of the hull. To hear the silence before the storm. To be the one person in the room brave enough to say the coordinates are wrong when everyone else is shouting that they're right." He turned back to the digital display, swiping his hand to reveal the raw, unfiltered acoustic data from the Atlantic, the ghost signals, that had once been his curse. Now they were his curriculum. "I was cast off a carrier because I saw a truth that was inconvenient for the chain of command," Bristol said, his gaze sweeping the room. "In this classroom, there is no such thing as an inconvenient truth. There is only the data and the lives it protects. You are not just navigators. You are the final line of defense against institutional blindness." The Admiral appeared at the back of the room, leaning against the doorframe. Whittaker didn't interrupt. He simply watched with a faint, proud smile as the man he had saluted in a rowboat transformed a generation of sailors. Bristol caught the Admiral's eye and offered a brief, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in the deep. As the lecture ended and the students began to file out, talking in hushed, energized tones, Bristol turned back to the window. The vast Pacific stretched out before him, blue and eternal. For the first time in his life, Bristol didn't feel like a liability or a ghost. He was the anchor. He was the teacher. And as he looked at his hands, resting firmly on the podium, they were perfectly, triumphantly still.